Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Wednesday night AJA Zoom series. We thank you for joining us once again, and we welcome all our viewers who are with us live on the Zoom, all our viewers who are watching live on Facebook, and everybody who's listening in on J-Air tomorrow, and who is watching the recording on our YouTube. Just to let you know, this is being recorded and will be available later today on our Facebook page and as well as our YouTube channel. I'd like to remind everybody that if you have any questions in the Q&A session, you can use the little raise hand button and we will get to you one by one in the Q&A. Thank you for joining us, and I'd like to hand over now to Michael Bird to introduce our wonderful speaker for tonight.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Danielle. Nima Gholam Ali Pour, I hope I've pronounced your name correctly, is an Iranian-born Swedish politician, author, activist, political commentator, and journalist. That's a mouthful. Nima came to Sweden as a refugee in 1988. Since the 2022 Swedish general election, he has been a member of the parliament representing the Sweden Democrats Party for the Malmo municipality constituency. Nima is a regular contributor to Gatestone Institute, Haaretz, and many other media outlets on the subject of Jews in Sweden and the problems of Muslim integration and many other subjects along those lines. Just a couple of articles that he wrote that I'll mention. In June of last year, Nima wrote, "The European Palestinians Conference held in Malmo, Sweden on May the 27th had clear and strong connections with Hamas, including through conference chairman Amin Abu Rashid. Before the conference, it was reported that several members of the parliament from Sweden's Green Party, Left Party, and Social Democratic Party would be participating in the conference." Another article that he wrote for Haaretz, the heading was, "Sweden's third largest city is not a welcoming place for Jews." That is as Malmo, and I think we all remember Malmo where they had the song festival recently. Welcome, Nima, to the Australian Jewish Association, and welcome to the Australian audience.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'll pass you now on to David, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Nima, for joining us. Now, Michael's given a comprehensive introduction about your background. Is there anything else that you think the group should know? The breadth of work that you're involved in the Swedish Parliament, and perhaps why you've focused significantly on the issue of Islamic immigration?
So I used to be an elementary school teacher here in Sweden before I became a politician. Today in the parliament, I work with mostly migration issues. So we are reforming the migration policies here in Sweden, and the Sweden Democrats are an important part of a part of the government, but we're in cooperation with the government. And we're changing the migration policies, and I'm a part of that work. And I sit in the Social Insurance Committee, which handles migration issues. And when it comes to Islamic migration, you know, Malmo is an example of what happens when a great amount of Muslims move into a city and influence the city culturally and politically. So I've grown up in Malmo, and so I have lived through that, and that's why I'm very involved in this. When I was younger, we lived in Rosengård, and there weren't any problems. So Malmo was a city where everybody could live. There was tolerance, and when I was growing up, I saw these problems, happen, and that's why I got involved, because suddenly there were some groups that weren't tolerated, and that bothered me.
Right. And what sort of proportions are we talking about in different parts of Europe? How significant has the demographic change been?
Well, like in Sweden, 2 out of 10 persons in Sweden are foreign-born. So, but when it comes to Muslims, there are some areas in Malmo where a majority of the people are Muslim immigrants. So the problem is it's not a bigger problem if you see the entire country, but there are some areas and some cities where Muslims are a big proportion of the population. So that's where the problem is, and in those areas, they influence the society a lot. And a consequence of that is that some parties adjust themselves to the Muslim population in some bigger cities like Malmo. So an example of that is that the ruling parties in Malmo, they give funds so the Muslims can celebrate their different holidays, like Eid al-Fitr. It's funded by the city of Malmo, by the taxpayers, because some parties which rule Malmo, they want to get the Muslim votes, and they adjust themselves to Muslim values or the policies or the policies that the Muslims have in Malmo, the opinions that they have in different issues. So that's how it influences the society. And another thing that you can see as a consequence of the Muslim immigration and how many Muslims there is in some places in Sweden is that there are lots of when you see the mosques in Sweden, almost all the mosques except Ahmadiyya, but almost all other mosques, they are either financed by foreign governments, or they have connections with Muslim Brotherhood. And this is nothing that is criticized by many parties who are close and get their votes from the Muslim population. And this is not criticized because those parties do not want to get into conflict with the Muslim population and lose those votes.
Right. So what impact has that had in the society? Why is it a problem? Are there crime issues? Are there other issues?
No, one problem is like when I wrote an article in Gaystone Institute about Jamal al-Haj. So it was he's a member of parliament, and he represented the Social Democrats. And when he arranged this Hamas conference in Malmo, he wasn't criticized by his own party, because his own party was afraid to criticize him because they don't want to criticize people who are connected with the Palestine issue and who support Palestine, even if those connections are to our organization which is a terrorist organization. So we see political parties and the society adjusting to Muslims in Sweden in different ways. So it could be taxpayers' money going to Muslim arrangements, or it could be being silent when politicians have connections to terrorist organizations like Hamas. But incident that happened recently was that when we had the elections to the European Union, a lot of parties on the left campaigned for Palestine. I mean, freeing Palestine. The issue has nothing to do with Europe, but because we have a large Muslim population that sympathizes with Palestine, parties on the left campaigned on freeing Palestine. And left party that did this the most, they actually won the election, especially in areas where there are lots of Muslims. They went forward, so and gained a lot of support. So in that way, it influences the society. And you can say that is bad or good, but according to me, I think it's bad that a large Muslim population is changing the values that exist in Europe, especially is becoming a threat for Jews, for the LGBTQ community, and for liberals in general. That those values are getting more influence in the society, and political parties are being forced to adjust to those values.
We hear occasionally about changes in crime rates on the streets. What's your observation? What's your information? Has there been any, assaults, rapes, robberies, those sort of things? Has there been any problem, like we hear in the media?
Yes. When it comes to more violent crimes, it has become more like explosions and shootings. It's more explosions and shootings in Sweden now. If you compare it like for 20 years ago, when I was growing up in Sweden, if somebody got shot, it was a big thing. But now today, it's kind of usual that when people get shot in Sweden, and so in that way it has become more normalized that the society is more violent. But I don't think that it has anything to do with Islam in general. I think that has to do with migration, and that the migration to Sweden, it has created segregation. So when the migrants came to Sweden, they were like they got their residence in some special areas. Like Rosengård is one area, but there are other areas that there lives a lot of migrants there. There are areas in Sweden where the majority are migrants. And in those areas, there are lots of social problems, and those social problems lead to crime, and violent crime. And that is something that Sweden wasn't prepared for. So the Swedish police force and the Swedish judicial system was adjusted to the Swedish population and the problems they had, but not to those kind of problems that came with the migrants. And some of this is because of social problems, but other crime problems are related because people come from violent countries and they have a lot of violent capital. They use violence in their home countries, and when they come here, they can use the same violence but in crime. And the Swedish society wasn't prepared for that.
One of the things that we've seen across a number of Western countries is that the universities have become quite hostile, and particularly since the 7th of October with encampments and such. Has that occurred in Sweden as well?
To some degree, but those kind of protests aren't normal in Sweden.
Right.
Sweden has in Sweden the Palestine movement has a very deeply rooted infrastructure among the left and the Social Democrats, and even the Green Party. So they usually protest with the support of those parties in the streets. They don't have the same strong infrastructure in the universities. They don't have the same support in the universities because they don't. I mean, the universities aren't that political in Sweden among the students.
Oh, that's good. And how has the Jewish community been affected? I mean, obviously, it's of significant interest to our group. Have there been any problem with the synagogues, with anti-Semitic incidents generally?
So there has been anti-Semitic incidents in Sweden under a long time, and the debate has been about if this is anti-Semitic people from inside the country, or if it is imported from Muslim countries. And that debate has been going for a long time. And I think now the last 3-4 years, there has been some kind of a consensus that the anti-Semitism is imported from Muslim countries, and that we have to deal with it. But sure, there has been a big threat against the Jewish community because you can even see it. If you pass the synagogue, you see there is much security. And what Jews in Sweden are almost they're asking for it a lot is funding for security for the synagogues, because there is a big threat against the synagogues. And you could even see it during the Eurovision that Jews didn't feel safe, and these Palestinian protests, they become violent. Another problem is a dilemma that has been for the Jewish community. They don't know if they can talk about this openly, because if they talk about it, maybe they're even attacked more than they are attacked today. Or if they should have a dialogue with the Muslim community. But like I said, when it comes to the Muslim community, the mosques in Sweden have if you see all mosques, except the Ahmadiyya, but all other mosques, they have connections with foreign governments, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, or they have connections with the Muslim Brotherhood. And this is something that it's very documented that these connections exist. There aren't any mosques in Sweden that are not extreme. There aren't any liberal mosques in Sweden. All the mosques have some kind of foreign agenda or the agenda of Muslim Brotherhood. And that is a big problem, because that means those who define Islam and represent Islam in Sweden are people who have an extreme agenda. So it has been very hard for the Jewish community to have a dialogue with the Muslims, which is something that the Jewish community wants to have. The Jewish community, under a long time, they do not want to like say that anti-Semitism is an Islamic problem. They wanted to have a dialogue, but that dialogue has been very hard to have because of the issues I raised.
Yeah. And what sort of impact do you think it's having economically? And we hear things about welfare patterns, the proportion of employment, unemployment, welfare dependency, etc. What's your observation?
So these segregated areas, these migrant areas that I talked about, there is very high unemployment in these areas. And there are also schools of very bad quality. And there is a reason for that. Many qualified teachers do not want to work in migrant areas because it's very hard to work in these schools. You could become threatened or something like that. And when there are lots of Muslim children, nothing, I don't want to say anything bad about them, but there is also a language in these schools where they have their own values. Like maybe they talk in a certain way about women, about the LGBT community, or about Jews. And many qualified teachers do not want to work in these schools. So these schools are of very low quality. At the same time, you have a population where there is unemployment. So the children see that their parents are unemployed and learn of that and see those are the role models for them. And at the same time, because of the unemployment and the bad schools, there is also crime and gangs. So there are big social problems in these areas, and there is unemployment, and therefore they have to get the welfare. But what the current government is doing is that we're in this during this period from 2022 to 2026, we are introducing migration reforms that makes it harder for non-citizens to get to be a part of the Swedish welfare system, or it makes it impossible for non-citizens. And we want to send a signal from Sweden that we do not want migrants who come to Sweden and get welfare. We want migrants who come here and work from day one. So we are introducing policies that will change this and make it harder for non-citizens to get to be a part of the welfare system.
Okay, so the main actions you're looking for, the main thing you're working on is the migration reform.
Yes.
Do you feel the government is responding adequately to the internal security, detecting any threats of terrorism, dealing with the crime issues that you mentioned?
Yes, absolutely. And I can give you a very good example. So when Hamas attacked Israel, there were celebrations on the street here in Malmo. So, you know, we just heard that people are celebrating, and we thought, what's this about? And we turned on the TV, and you know, they were killing people in Israel. So, and something that the government is introducing now is that if you support terrorists, you can get your residence permit revoked. It
Yep.
will be recalled. So, and I had a debate with the migration minister and asked her, like, these people that are celebrating Hamas, is this an example of people who would get the residence permit recalled? And she said, yes, that's a good example. So we are introducing very harsher migration policies that will solve some problems. So if you are supporting Hamas in Sweden, like the Social Democrat Jamal El-Haj did, and you only have a residence permit, you don't have citizenship, you can get that residence permit revoked, and then you have to leave the country. And that is a very good signal that we do not want extremists in this country. We do not want terrorist supporters in Sweden, and we do not want people who threaten Jews in Sweden. So we are solving some problems with migration policies.
Now, I know that you're obviously a member of the Swedish Parliament, but there's a lot of liaison with other European countries. Is what you've described similar occurring in other European countries, in France, in Germany, in the other Scandinavian countries?
Yes, it is. I mean, an idea that is floating in the European Parliament and the Commission right now is that you should receive you should receive asylum seekers in a third country. So instead of them coming to Europe, they will come to a third safe country and there go through asylum process. And then maybe come to Europe or get asylum in the third country. And third country, that's a country outside the European Union. So that idea is being discussed right now because we have had a demographic change in Europe that has had a very negative impact. So many of the European values has been challenged. And we have got problems like minorities and, you know, like the Jewish population becoming more threatened by other groups, especially Muslims. So these discussions are being held in other countries too. And Italy has their asylum process now in Albania.
Okay.
So these things are happening elsewhere too.
How big is the Jewish community in Sweden? How big is it? How many people?
I don't have exact numbers there, but I know that in Malmo it has been shrinking under a long time now.
Are we talking 100,000, 200,000?
No, I don't think it's that big.
Not even that. Okay.
No.
Okay. All right. I'm going to just do our 1 minute break, and then we'll open up for general questions. And as we do each
Sorry
week.
about my English.
No, your English is fine. As we do each week, at the end of this event, please go to the AJA website, everyone, and make sure you do something active if you're not yet a supporter. And remember, we're approaching the end of the financial year, so it's a good opportunity to make a donation, and we do need tangible support. Make sure you like and follow AJA on social media, which is just going enormously well, and join the email list so that you get the notice of events and updates. Now, next week, we have the Shadow Attorney General, Senator Michaela Cash, booked, and we'll be looking at the Labor government proposals that impact on religious freedom and religious discrimination. So it's a great privilege to be able to host the Shadow Attorney General, and we might ask her also about the prescribing of certain organisations that are not yet recognised as terrorist organisations, but should be, because I know she's involved in that as well.
Right, so we've got a lot of written questions. Best way to ask a question is put your hand up, so more chance of getting asked. But first, let's start with Alan.
Thanks, Robert. Nima, with migrants in the past, the host country's moral code and laws would always come before an individual's religious beliefs or cultural beliefs. So, for example, if migrants came to Australia after the war, they didn't demand that all the shops be closed on Shabbat. But it seems that with migration from Islamic countries, it's the other way around. The migrants seem to put their own cultural and moral values ahead of the country that they move into. Now, this is clearly going to be a problem with assimilation. Is there any way that this can possibly be addressed? Because most countries are probably experiencing the same thing.
And so this is a difficult issue because Denmark changed their legislation last year because of the Quran burnings. So Denmark has implemented a legislation, or they have decided about a legislation that will make it forbidden to burn Qurans, and that limits the freedom of expression. Now, Sweden had the same discussion last year, but we didn't enforce any legislation. But when we had the Quran burnings in Sweden and the Quran crisis, there were, all the mosques in Sweden demanded that we should have legislation that limits freedom of expression and the Quran burning. So you could not, like, according to the mosques in Sweden, you could not burn Qurans, and they thought that we should have legislation on that. And the important thing here is that we have politicians that stand up and just say that religion is religion, politics is politics, that religion should not influence the society. Your religion is your religion, and if somebody else does not respect your religion, that's it. That we have a secular society, and we should have politicians who stand up for that. And it's not harder than that. Now, in Denmark, they couldn't stand up for that, they instead compromise their own legislation and forbid Quran burnings. And I don't think we will do that in Sweden, because Swedes, there is a Swedish opinion that we should have that politics and religion should be separated. So I think that if the politicians do what the people want, this shouldn't be a problem.
Okay, next up we have Anne. Would you like to mute and ask your question?
Hi, so I just posted my question here. My question is with Khomeini taking university students in America by saying, "Dear American university students in America, you are standing on the right side of history, given your background that you are Iranian. How do you feel about this?" And with Gender Wiles in Europe winning the election, and obviously people in Europe being concerned about immigration, what chances of, how do you feel about the immigration reform that's happening in Europe? So those are my two questions.
Can someone just
So I think the question, two questions. What is there any hope for the students with the Khamenei praising them and saying they're the hope for the future? And I mean, let's stay with that one, maybe.
Okay, so Khamenei is a dictator, and the Iranian regime rapes women in prison. That's well documented. So if you think support from that kind of regime should, give you moral boosting or something like that, then you're on the wrong side of history. So any student listening to Khamenei it does not have any democratic principles. That's the only thing I have to say about that. And if they don't understand it, then these people who accept support from Khamenei, these are the same people who support North Korea, Russia, or other autocratic and dictatorial countries. So I think if you have democratic principles, this is a easy question to understand.
Okay, next up we have David. Would you like to ask your question?
There was a second question there from.
Second question, maybe we'll come back to.
Was about Geert Wilders. How Geert Wilders is viewed in view of his success.
Geert Wilders is. He has like liberal values. He's. I mean, most of the right parties in Europe, they're standing up for liberal values. So they're saying we will not limit our freedom of expression. We will not change our laws to adjust to the Muslim population. We will not like change ourselves in Europe to adjust ourselves to people, religious people who are coming from the Middle East and demanding stuff. So I don't think like most people support that. And the problem, the reason that the parties on the right haven't grown even more is because there is a lot of backlash from the media. There is a demonization from the media, much criticism from the media coming, and trying to put us, give us a lot of criticism that we don't deserve. So Geert Wilders, he has actually very liberal values if you see what his ideology is, and the same is the same for many parties on the right. They're trying to sustain a liberal society against demands from religious zealots.
Okay, next up we have David.
Yes, hello. Nima, it was I who reached out to you on Facebook with a report on comparing Bible and Quran. I was wondering if you received that via the email address you gave me. I don't suppose you would have had time to read it yet.
Yeah, I received your mail and the documents with it, and my answer to that is I think that there has been a radicalization of Islam,
Mm.
During the latest 150 years. And a lot of problems with Islam today is because of political and geopolitical issues. So I don't think that Muslims in general, kill people or hurt people or something like that. But I think those who represent Muslims, the mosques and the theologians in the Middle East, they have political agendas. And therefore, we have a representation of Islam that makes unreasonable demands in Europe. And I think if they make reforms in Islam, if they somehow liberalize Islam, that problem could be solved. But today, we have very conservative theologians that talk and represent Islam, and that is the problem. I think a lot of these problems is because Muslim leaders have a political agenda.
All right, next up we have Hazel.
Hi. We have a government who have been very soft on pro-Palestinian rallies, a lot of anti-Semitic rallies and so on, presumably out of fear for the Muslim backlash and for fear of voter backlash. Given the policies that you are talking about implementing in Sweden, and oh gosh, I wish we could have them here, I'm very curious to know what the Muslim response has been to that, because you do have a large Muslim population in Sweden as well.
Yeah. So those who represent the Muslims in Sweden, they're very critical. But a lot of Muslims, they're like, they go to work and they come home. They're not so political. But I think like you have to understand that most Muslims aren't political activists. So there hasn't been a great backlash from the Muslims, but there has been a lot of criticism from the mosques and from Muslim institutions. But I mean, most Muslims in Sweden, they live in the segregated areas. They want good schools for their kids. They want jobs and they want security. So, and they want freedom of religion. They don't, those who make these unreasonable demands, those are, the religious zealots in the mosques. And then when it comes to anti-Semitism, you have to see the reasons behind that. Like a lot of Muslims, they come from countries that has had historical conflicts with Israel. So in these countries, they have indoctrinated Muslims to hate Jews because Israel has been the enemy. So those Muslims who come here, they have values that they have had from childhood, indoctrinated from the government, from the parents, that they have to hate Jews. And, I've talked to, Muslims here in Sweden, and, when you talk to them about Israel, and it's a democracy, there is an Arab population, they just don't believe you. They think that Israel is this monster because they have been told that Israel is some kind of terrible nation from when they were children. And, if they think something else, they have to leave the group. So it's two different things. The hostility against Israel is one thing, but that the government wants to, wants migrants who commit crimes to leave the country, wants migrants that are extremists to leave the country. That's another thing, and that is not something that Muslims oppose in general. But sadly enough, the Muslim institutions oppose that. But that is because, like I said, Muslim institutions in Sweden and in Europe, they have almost always connections with foreign governments who finance them or with the Muslim Brotherhood.
Okay, next up we have Emmanuel. Just still
You're not
muted.
unmuted yet, Emmanuel. Oh, there you are.
Okay. Just as a matter of interest, has the government ever done any analysis on the Muslims that are already there, putting aside Muslims that will keep on coming, but the fact that they tend to have larger families, which means that technically speaking, irrespective of what happens with Israel or not, you could be very well outnumbered statistically just by the Muslims, simply because they're reproducing at a much faster rate than the rest of the country.
Yes, and I acknowledge that problem, but the government does not have an analysis. They don't they haven't examined that problem, and that's because it's still a sensitive issue. So, migration has been a sensitive issue in Europe. Islam has been a sensitive issue in Europe. And that issue, demographics, and that one part of the population is growing and another part is not growing. That's a sensitive issue still. But I acknowledge that the problem exists. But we have to work to lift the problem and make it a problem that politicians talk about. But today, politicians do not talk about that. It's very sensitive.
Yeah, see, we're getting a lot of written questions. We've had one that's asking about, you were saying the demographics, Islamic parties potentially. But is that a risk to Sweden?
It depends. So we have an Islamic party here in Sweden called Nyams, okay? And the more the Social Democrats get a strained relationship with the Muslim population, the more that Islamic party gets support. So Muslims who relied on Social Democrats and the Left Party and the Green Party, and if they feel that those parties do not support Muslims anymore, then they go to Nyams. So it could be a problem if the Social Democrats with time have to be more critical of Muslim values, of Islamic values in Sweden, or the demands of the Muslim population, okay? So if Social Democrats and the Left Party, if they become more critical of Islamic values, those kind of parties can grow. And in the last election, they got elected into some municipal commissions here in Sweden, but they are not in the parliament. And they got a lot of support in areas where there lives a lot of Muslims, like Rosengård is such an area. They got more than 20% in Rosengård. So they get a lot of support in those areas. But in the rest of the society, where people are integrated into the society, they get almost no support. So as long as we have European values as a hegemony in the society, as the majority values, those kind of parties will not be a threat. But if the demographic changes and Muslim values become normal in the society, sure, those kind of parties can grow very fast.
And we've had a bit of debate in the chat here about the Jewish population, how many there are, and what's the future for Jewish people in Sweden. Have you heard much about that?
So I just checked it out, and there are 25,000 Jews in Sweden, but they don't register. They don't register religion here in Sweden, people's religion. So that's an estimate, 25,000 Jews. But the thing is that in Malmo, the number has gone down, and many Jews are leaving Sweden because they don't feel safe anymore. Sadly enough, when the number of Muslims go up, and we have the conflicts we have in the Middle East, I mean, Jews, they become a group that is very threatened and persecuted even in Sweden. So like there were some Israeli journalists that came to Sweden, and I told them, do not go out with Jewish symbols, you will get, attacked. And they were attacked. Like, it's a very hard situation for Jews in Sweden, and the question is, how long can they live under these circumstances, and when do they when will they take the decision to move? And many have moved from Sweden.
It's dreadful. That's dreadful.
Yes, it's horrible. And just to say, it wasn't like this when I was growing up in Sweden. I mean, these things happened during after the year 2000 and forward, when the Muslim population started to grow. And, it's a very sad situation.
I think, there's been quite a bit of Aliyah moving to Israel from Sweden. And unfortunately, Australia's probably not that far behind. So, David, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah. I'll just show a photo that we received, and I showed Nima this earlier. It's of the King and Queen of Sweden, and they have around their necks a classic Palestinian scarf. And I asked him whether the photo was genuine, and you explained it very well, Nima. So can you do that again for our audience? What does this photo mean?
So the photo is genuine, and there is an article in Swedish Public Service that explains this. And what happened was that they were going and meeting people, and just people were meeting them, and suddenly somebody put these scarves around their head, giving them flowers, putting scarves, and they did not understand what the scarves were, because they were just going forward and meeting people. So afterwards, they took off the scarves, but when they were going there and shaking hands and all that kind of stuff, somebody put on the scarves and took a photo. So they were ambushed, and they do not support the Palestinian issue or something like that. The king in Sweden is not political. He's not a political figure. He's more a symbol, in Australia.
Sounds like sensible people.
Okay.
Next up, we have Dina.
Could I ask, is the Christian community in Sweden under threat? Do they feel threatened? Have there been examples of violence against them?
So you're raising a very complicated issue. I will tell you about this. So Sweden had a state church. Maybe what a state church is, like Great Britain. I don't know if they have a state church, but Sweden had a state church, a church that was run by the state until the year 2000. And after the year 2000, it became independent from the state, but it is a big church. So the majority of Swedes are in the Church of Sweden, including me. So it's a big church. We have a big church. The problem is that this church is very political. And it's very left-leaning. And the Church of Sweden sympathizes with the Palestinians. So a majority of Swedes are in the church because of the history of the church, because they own a lot of buildings and they are everywhere. But the church leadership itself supports the Palestinians. Therefore, there is not a conflict between Muslims or Muslims who sympathizes with Palestine and the church and the Christians, okay? So, but then there are Pentecostal churches in Sweden who partly sympathize with Israel. Also in the Pentecostal church, there are some people who sympathize with the Palestinians. But the churches in Sweden are very political, and most of the church infrastructure support the Palestinians. So there is not a conflict between Muslims and Christians because of that.
Interesting.
And also like the church in Sweden also supports Muslim activists, so they are very left-leaning. So there is no reason for Muslims to criticize the church.
It's not a very good church. There you go.
No.
Next up.
I have written a very good article about the Church of Sweden in Gatestone Institute. So if somebody's like wants to know more about the Church of Sweden and details and that more, so just read about it on Gatestone Institute.
Gatestone Institute. Okay. Next up, Michael.
Need to unmute, Michael.
Is that better?
Yep, now you're with us.
Okay. Nima, you were talking about the church. The foreign ministers of Sweden have generally been very anti-Israel. And of course, Sweden is always or mostly voting against Israel at the United Nations. That's another problem. But actually, the question I wanted to ask you was, you're a known well, you print in publication about support of Israel. You do criticize Islam. You criticize Iran. What about you personally? Do you get threats? Are you under threat? Do you worry about your security in Sweden?
So threats, sure. I get threats all the time, but we have a good security service at the parliament who has close connections with the security police in Sweden. So I get a lot of support when it comes to security now when I'm elected into parliament. But sure, there is always people threaten me, and I try to keep a low profile when I am in private. Because somebody always knows me when I'm in Malmo. So, but Swedish politics is still not so violent. You get threats, but I know if somebody wanted to do something, they would do it. They would not threaten me. They would just do it. But Swedish security police does a great job. They are monitoring all groups that could be really dangerous, not just threaten. Groups that are dangerous are monitored by the security police.
Thank you.
And I think the second part of the question was about the foreign policy of Sweden. Like, I think Sweden was it the first Western country to recognize a Palestinian state, maybe. So what's the go?
I think they were the first, yeah. But that was a social democratic government, and all the parties that now govern Sweden protested when Sweden recognized Palestine. I mean, we have a government today that, according to the left, is very supportive of Israel. We do not have those connections that we had with Palestine before. And the reason is that the Social Democratic Party has formal connections with Fatah. And that's why the Swedish government, during the Social Democrats, supported Palestine as much as they did. But today, we are actually supporting Israel. We are one of the European countries that are supporting Israel the most. But a problem still is that we're giving aid that reaches the wrong hands. But that is something that we in the parliament have to work with. But the aid to Palestine has been reduced.
Reducing is good, yeah. All right. I think, well, let's see if we can fit in one or two more questions. Alan, you are next.
Sorry, Alan, you're muted.
There we go. While we're talking about Swedish politics, I think everybody understands that Sweden's generally very, quote, progressive and left-leaning. What's the strength of the conservative movement in Sweden? Is there any likelihood of something happening there, as for example, what happened in Italy?
Okay, so according to several experts, Sweden has the harshest migration policies today after Italy. And we are also inside the European Union. So, and we are also the country after Romania that gives the least residence permits to people in Sweden. So we have a very harsh migration policy, and we have created that during a short time. Then when it comes to several other issues, Sweden is a liberal country. Like when it comes to the relationship between the sexes, Sweden will always be a very liberal country. But in all those issues where there's a support from the people to become more conservative, like the judicial system, Sweden is getting more conservative, and all the other parties are being forced to adjust. So the big party, the Social Democrats, are being they're adjusting more to the politics of the Sweden Democrats when it comes to the judicial system and migration policies. And those are like the big issues where there's a support for conservative policies. But in general, like abortion issue, Sweden is very liberal, and there is not support for conservative positions in Sweden when it comes to those issues. But when it comes to migration and the judicial system, Sweden, I would say, is very conservative today.
Yeah, I was in Sweden once, and I remember the alcohol laws are very strict. You can only buy it from the government or something. I never heard of such a thing.
Yes, and we will have the monopoly on alcohol sales. We will still have it. Nobody is supporting anything else. So in many ways, Sweden is a very conservative country, but in some ways, there is no support for conservative positions.
There you go. Maybe it's the Viking history. I think we're just about up to time. We see Gabor's put a question in the chat. He says maybe Sweden can be saved by a moderate Sverige Democrat coalition. So there you go. It's maybe an idea.
We have a moderate Sweden Democrat coalition now. So the parties in government is moderates, the Christian Democrats, the liberals, and they have majority because of the support of the Sweden Democrats. So there is something called the Tito agreement, and that's the agreement between these four parties, and that's the agreement that is the foundation of the government today. And in the Tito agreement, it says all the things that has to be done during this period, 2022 to 2026, and we're working with that. I'm working with that in the migration area to do all the things that is in the Tito agreement. And we have also arranged a Tito agreement 1.0, and we're updating the Tito agreement. But what is governing Sweden today is the Tito agreement, and the Sweden Democrats also have people in the government buildings that are working with the ministers, because the Tito agreement has to be they have to work with the Tito agreement, and Sweden Democrats have to be in the building and work with them. So we have a Sweden Democrat moderate coalition with the Christian Democrats and liberals.
There you go. Learn something new every day. So I want to thank you so much. It's been a very informative talk. The chat's been going off, and everyone's been learning a lot and enjoying it. So thank you so much. How can people keep up to date with what you're doing? Do you have social media?
You see, my English is so bad. It's because I write in Swedish all the time. I talk English often. I talk Swedish often. But you can follow me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. But it's all in Swedish. But I have some English talking people who follow me, but then they get it translated. So you can follow me there and get my writings translated to English. But I'm sorry for my English. I want to say that because it's kind of horrible that I talk English like this. But I'm sorry.
No, your English has been very good. Thank you, Michael. Do you want to say some words of thank you? And then...
Thank you very much.
Michael, you're muted.
Yes, Nima, we first came across you when Alan and I interviewed you on Nothing Left on JA Radio quite a few years ago. And it's really been a pleasure. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you, Michael, for organizing. Thank you again so much to everyone for joining and for the very, very informative talk. Look forward to seeing everyone next week.